So the next session is by Hetal Dalal from IiAS, and it's called "Do Markets Reward Governance?" Let me just introduce that. So governance practices, we believe, must be fit for purpose, right? When companies are starting up, these practices are largely driven by the promoter. But once companies get listed, there's a larger set of stakeholders. There needs to be a board-driven approach to governance that relies on structures which have been built in to ensure equitable treatment of all stakeholders. Now, while all of this is necessary, I think the question that jumps to mind for everyone is it worth it? Is the additional investment in governance worth it? For investors who are chasing, short-term yields, companies chasing profitability, where does governance fit? To answer this question, we have our next speaker, Hetal Dalal, who's the president and COO of IiAS. As an introduction, as a quick introduction, and you will find this on the microsite as well. Hetal is president and COO at Institutional Investor Advisory Services, prior to which she was director of the ratings business development team at CRISIL Limited. She's held several leadership roles across many business verticals during her time at CRISIL, and her experience covers analytics, operations, business development, amongst other things. So without taking up too much time, I'll just hand it over to Hetal to continue.
Great. Thank you very much, Anup. And we've had a wonderful 2 sessions talking about, the experiences of starting businesses, going from the startup stage to listing to becoming dominant businesses in their space. Today, we're going to use a little bit more of, data and analysis to talk about, do markets really reward governance? It's fine to say that corporate governance standards have to be better, regulators are pushing it, but in the end, does it really mean it? I mean, this is the fundamental theme that we're going to talk about. I'm going to start off by first talking about what is the corporate governance landscape in India. I think just setting the tone in terms of where we are. Then we talk about, can you really measure corporate governance? Given that a lot of it is, not necessarily, a lot of it is not objective and quantifiable. Is there a way to really measure corporate governance? And what does the measurement really finally tell you if you do attempt it? And in that bargain, we then answer the question of, do markets really reward governance? So let's start with the first piece, and this is setting context around what is the corporate governance landscape for it. So if you look at the shareholding pattern, right, today, structurally, 56% of the shareholding is still held by promoters. About 27 by institutions, and you have retail shareholders, right? What has changed dramatically now is that more than 75% of the capital is getting voted upon. This is large. If you look at it, maybe like 6-7 years ago, you basically didn't have too many investors voting, and most of it was show of hands, and therefore resolutions are easily passed. It never became a critical sort of discussion. When e-voting came in and the fact that stewardship responsibilities came in for institutional investors, voting became a much more prominent sort of piece in the entire corporate governance debate. So this is how voting patterns are played out, right? By and large, you'll find that all sorts of shareholders tend to support management resolutions. Institutional shareholders have now begun to provide a little bit of pushback. So therefore, when you look at it in the context of, the for, against, and abstain votes, you are seeing a 6% on an aggregate institutions actually voting there against the management proposals, right? Promoters tend to always, of course, vote for. The very marginal against vote is typically when you have disputes in promoter factions, and the abstention usually just refers to areas where they are conflicted or they're interested in that particular resolution, and therefore they don't really vote. Retail shareholders don't really have a strong influencing capability yet as far as the voting outcomes are concerned. So this is really how the lay of the land is in terms of what drives shareholder resolutions and voting on the shareholder resolutions, right? But investors are now asserting themselves far. Number of resolutions which are getting defeated is increasing. You're seeing the pushback in all sorts of categories, not just related party transactions, which seems to be the more intuitive category because That seems to be the more contentious sort of resolution. You're seeing pushback on board changes. Now, you may debate that a large pushback is also a function of the fact that number of resolutions for director appointments itself is large. But notwithstanding the fact that investors are pushing back on board appointments tells you that they're now looking at board more central to the ability of a business to deliver and to the governance practices of companies, right? ESOPs is, while you're seeing the pushback at 18% of, in terms of rejected resolutions, and we'll come to that a little later. But it's actually the most contentious of all resolutions in terms of the kind of voting which happens and the greatest pushback that we see from investors. Surprisingly, related party transactions, which was the original sort of uh, route through which financial leakages tended to happen, is actually becoming a little bit more contained. Yes, there are transactions which tend to be prejudicial to the interest of minority shareholders, undoubtedly, but by and large, a lot of these transactions tend to be operational. So this is essentially how we're looking at what's really happening as far as the pushback is concerned, right? Some of the resolutions which have been defeated, and we've looked at more than 200 resolutions being defeated over 2014, and these have been sort of front and center as far as media is concerned, as far as everybody's eyeballs are concerned, and more importantly, these are companies which are meaningful, right? They are part of major indices. Some of them are MNCs, some of them are even PSUs. And so you find that a lot of this is across the board, and there are no select sort of companies which are holier than others, right? You look at IDFC, iShares, some of these are very well Linde, some of these are very well-known companies with large institutional holding, which have seen this kind of pushback. And the whole piece about some of this is really, investors venting a little bit of their frustration as far as companies not being able to measure up to their expectations. I mean, IDFC is a classic case in terms of what's really happening as far as, winding down the company and merging the IDFC bank, creating value and unlocking the value that it already has as far as the operating business are concerned. Linde, the whole debate was around, really the fact that you have an unlisted 100% fellow subsidiary, where a lot of the business is really moving to that particular subsidiary, and therefore shareholders sort of voted against the related party transaction. Aisha, again, more in the context of just disclosures around executive remuneration. So one of the themes that we will cover through this presentation also is on executive remuneration in terms of what investors want to see vis-a-vis what they're actually getting to see. And that will sort of come a little later down the line, but this is really where some of the pushback is, right? We talked about the fact that ESOPs are the most voted against resolutions. And this is across the board, right? And there is fundamentally, and this is important from a startup space specifically, because a lot of the remuneration tends to happen through stock options. And there is a fundamental dichotomy in how investors look at stock options vis-a-vis how management looks at stock options, right? Management looks at it as deferred compensation. Investors want to look at it as alignment of interest. So one debate always will be, extent of dilution. But when you look at stock options in listed companies, the extent of, at least for the listed companies now, the extent of dilution doesn't tend to be very high. In the startup space, the extent of dilution we expect to be significantly higher. The other most contentious piece is the exercise price. I think there is this whole coterie of, and again, exercise price in terms of, is it linked to the market price or not? Financial services tends to give out stock options at market prices. It's a sort of industry practice. You see in other cases, you'll have companies issue stock options at either deep discounts or almost at face value, which are called restricted stock units. And the debate, and again, the whole issue becomes talent, right? Are you able to attract and retain the existing talent, given that there is a fight for quality talent in the marketplace? And this is across sort of sectors. Investors are looking at it at the other end, right? Investors are saying that if you're going to issue the stock options at a deep discount, employees are already in the money. So therefore, the alignment of interest with the shareholder agenda becomes limited. So one of the things that they look at is that if you are going to issue stock options at a deep discount, and you could do that for a variety of reasons, including promoters not wanting to dilute themselves even further, do you therefore have a certain performance metrics which carries to the vesting as well, right? So vesting criteria becomes extremely important. Um, and therefore, this dichotomy of how stock options will be viewed by management vis-a-vis investors is really what is creating this divide, and therefore the degree of pushback that investors are giving stock options. So from a startup space perspective, right, where a lot of the companies are actually paying out higher quantum in stock options rather than in actual cash, I think this is, once you list, this becomes a critical piece, and it's no longer as it was earlier in an unlisted era, where the dilution was where the promoter controlled the dilution. I think a lot of this now emanates from alignment of interest to investors, and this is a significant change that the startup world will now have to address once it becomes listed. Yeah, beyond, even if you look at it beyond resolutions getting defeated, right? I think there is a very strong messaging that investors are giving companies um, in terms of the degree of pushback of their votes, right? On RSU plans, on remuneration, director appointments, related party transactions. You've also had a certain set of resolutions. I mean, we've also had directors resign on the morning of the meeting. So effectively, you would argue that those could have possibly been that resolutions have been defeated. But really, this is the degree of push. When you're seeing it in large Sensex stock or Nifty companies, right? You've got not just this list, right? So it's across the board and larger companies which are facing this degree of pushback. We're also seeing early stages of activism. Now, when you look at shareholder activism globally, right, the context is, are you able to unlock value and can you create more value through shareholder activism? I think in India, by and large, the shareholder activism we tend to see is really trying to stop any further value destruction. Fortis Healthcare is a great example of shareholder activism which has gone well, which has done well for the company. When the existing management was removed, existing board was removed, you had a fresh independent board which brought in a strategic investor and bailed the company out of its of being cash strapped and building back the business to where it used to be. We're seeing a lot of pushback in Dish TV and Z, where you have Invesco, Yes Bank and Invesco, respectively, trying to get a significant change in the board. And that's of course playing out as far as the regulations are concerned. It's gone to all the various courts, and both these cases will likely end up with the Supreme Court, which will finally settle the dust on how regulation works as far as shareholder activism is concerned. So this, in India, this is a stage where shareholder activism is actually testing the mechanisms, right? We haven't seen class action, all the class action suits have been notified. We haven't seen that tested. The regulation for Z and Dish TV on, the ability of an investor to appoint an independent director and call an EGM is getting tested. So it's an interesting time for corporate India in terms of how some of these issues are playing out. You have early seeds also. In 2017, we had investors in PTC India and Alembic trying to get a board seat because they fundamentally felt that there was greater ability in unlocking value, right? Alembic had shareholding in Alembic Pharma, PTC in PTC Finance, and therefore, is there a way of you either using the excess cash you have in the books or being able to unlock the value that you have in a particular holding for stakeholders? These didn't sort of play out eventually because the board was able to block some of these measures. But these are early signs of investors sort of thinking in that particular manner. Has it been pushed to a level where you're seeing effectiveness yet? No, we haven't. Related party transactions, the more interesting ones that we saw over the years was, of course, Maruti and Raymond's. PTL Enterprise is a relatively small company, which was a great example in terms of how over a period of time promoters have been incubating businesses inside listed companies, but as soon as they become sort of profitable, moving them to privately held companies. And Raymond's was, of course, the JK House transaction, and Maruti is the Suzuki Gujarat plant transaction, which I'm sure most of the audience today is aware of and has seen, has sort of lived through some of the debates around these transactions. So the question is for companies, right? And for startups as well, how do they therefore learn from some of these experiences? So we've got a cloud-based service called IiAS Adrian, named after Adrian Cadbury, who's considered the father of corporate governance, with the Cadbury report, which came out first, which actually tracks what are the kind of resolutions in companies have put out. And we cover like 900 companies, right, which is 96% of market cap. So it covers everything that we cover, which is pretty much a dominant section of Indian capital markets, where we've looked at 50,000 resolutions and over 9,000 meetings. It basically allows you to therefore search and function and use this as a source to understand how other companies have driven agendas, what are the kind of resolutions, and where investors have actually pushed back, right? So it's basically tells you can search. I mean, the features are very simple. It allows you to search by resolution category, type, all of that. It also allows you to pivot in terms of how investors vote. So let's say you have a resolution that you're bringing in. You want to know, you have, let's say, BlackRock as an investor or HDFC as an investor. You want to know how they typically vote and stuff like this. It becomes easier for you to sort of navigate. For startups, this is important, right? More from the perspective that they've created businesses where there was no path. They are now entering the listed space, where a lot of companies have seen a path. Their journey is going to be different. But is there a way of learning from what others have done and avoiding some of these pitfalls? There is, and this is a service that we think will help investors. Let's talk about measuring corporate governance. And there is always the contrarian view, right? There is one view which says that governance cannot be measured. It's about treating all stakeholders equitably. It's about behavior. It's not about checking the boxes. And as the quote had said, it's about being right as far as the spirit is concerned, not necessarily about the letter. And therefore, can you really measure governance? But the reality is that if you don't measure, you won't get anywhere, right? You won't be able to benchmark yourself on a relative scale. And therefore, there has to be some attempt to create measurable metrics around governance practices of companies. Is it all encompassing and 100% accurate? It will never be. What you can only count on is really that the assessment is done, keeping in mind what is the right sort of path to take, rather than simply looking at the check the box sort of approach. So we've created a corporate governance evaluation framework along with IFC and PSC. This was created in 2016, part of IFC's effort on market development, right? So they supported the ASEAN scorecard, and they said that therefore in India also, given the size of the market, there is a need to develop a corporate governance scorecard. So we've been the technical partners along with PSE, and we've looked at, based the entire scorecard on the G20 principles of corporate governance. And I'm building this entire context because when we finally look at answering the question on do markets reward governance, understanding the context of how we've arrived at the conclusion is important, right? So we've looked at the 6 principles, 2 of the G20 OECD principles. 2 of them are market relevant principles, right? Because the G20 OECD principles apply across geographies. If we've taken India as a domain, so the market principles are a given. Regulation, nature of investors, activism, all of that is a given. And within that particular space, can you therefore look at benchmarking governance practices on a relative scale? So we've taken the 4 other pillars that we fundamentally believe are in control of the company. The rights and equitable treatment of shareholders, the role of stakeholders, disclosure and transparency, and the responsibilities of the board. And use those to develop a set of questions that we ask, and a set of framework to be able to measure governance, right? So the idea, of course, in principle is that this is, one is it's going to be globally sort of accepted. It's a globally accepted measure. Secondly, what we've done is we've taken what the global benchmarks are and we've adjusted them for the Indian context, right? Because every market will have a different stage of development. And therefore, doing a copy paste and a cookie cutter approach doesn't really make sense. We've been reviewing the scorecard, and some of these questions are also going to change effectively this year. But ideally, I mean, the way we actually looked at it is that look at benchmarking India to global practices, and therefore look at How does India peg, and what are the fundamental characteristics of the market that you can actually build into the assessment? Um, we've done this from the lens of the investor, the equity investor. So therefore, we're using publicly available information. Because the idea is that that is really what is available to the equity investor. We've also modified, we have derivative products for unlisted companies as well as for lenders. And the way we look at it is that I'll come to sort of a little bit of why, right? So over the past 5 years, we've been publishing our assessment of the top 100 companies. And so BSE 100 accounts for roughly 70 to 75% of the market cap in any given year. So I think that's reasonably reflective of where the capital markets are in terms of their governance practices. We are scheduled to come out with our 2021 research in the beginning of February. And that should again be a telling sign of where what's really happened over the past 1 year. This is the structure of the question. And again, I'm building a base to really finally coming to that conclusion of what does it mean when you measure governance. So for example, you have one question. It says, does the remuneration structure for executive pay align pay with performance, right? And then we have 0 if there's no variable pay, because that's just fixed cost. 1 if there is short-term incentive, and 2 if there is if they marry long-term and short-term incentives. Now, when we look at executive remuneration, and this is again, when you look at executive remuneration over the years, right, pay has consistently the growth in pay has consistently outpaced that of revenues and profits. We have seen this consistently over the past few years, and in the COVID crisis, we think that the issue has become a little bit more entrenched. So therefore, the question we ask is, when you look at NRCs and they're able to set the structure itself, right? Do they have a proper mix of variable pay, which drives both long-term and short-term, and therefore how they look at executive remuneration that's paid out in terms of aligning to the business? Again, does the board have sufficient skills, competence, and expertise? Now, this is, if you look at a lot of the global failures, right? One of the lessons of the global failures is that while you have a really robust board, you don't have anybody who understands the domain of the business. I mean, Theranos is a very classic example, which had a really sort of heavyweight board, but really nobody from the pharma industry which understood the background, or even in terms of any experience around pharmaceuticals, testing, or any of that, right? So the question we ask is, therefore, do you have, one of the things we test for is, do you just have someone who understands the domain business? You just need someone independent who's going to be able to challenge the management assumptions, if nothing else. And this is not to say that the conversation has to be acrimonious. It just has to be, you just need to have an independent view around what the management is trying to do. The other is to say that, do you have a robust set of skills? And, regulation today has asked have a more holistic picture of saying that these are the skills the business needs going forward, given how the environment is changing, given where the board is going to be or the company is going to be, and therefore these are the set of skills I need in the board, right? And that is a more comprehensive, which would help boards navigate the newer challenges and newer businesses. So what does the assessment entail? Yes, we look at all the primary disclosures, but most importantly, right, and to sort of not be repetitive, but one of the things we do look at is really substance over form. I think a lot of the regulation today is in form, and one of the things we are very careful in terms of the assessment is to say that we're looking at substance over form. So for example, if you have a dividend policy, right, great, dividend policy is important in terms of ensuring that you're messaging to investors. Do you actually have a targeted payout ratio? That's more clear messaging rather than just having a policy. You have a great conflict of interest policy, but if your CEO is going to get embroiled in related party transactions, has the policy really worked? So these are some of the issues and questions that we tend to ask before we sort of score companies on this on the scorecard. So let's come to the results, and this is the most interesting piece, right? We've divided the 100 scores, it's weighted scores. Right? So we taken the 70 questions, divided the total score of 100 into 4 categories. 0 to 50 is basic, and you would argue that this is a high threshold. If you have 4 categories, why is it not equally spread? The reality is, when you look at Indian regulations, when you benchmark them across other markets, and you'll see this as we go along, Indian regulations tend to be significantly tighter in terms of their expectations of companies than you will see most of the other markets. So typically, if you meet regulations, you're just doing the basic stuff, you're likely to hit that 50th mark, right? The companies which don't tend to hit even 50 are usually the ones which are in violation of basic compliance requirements, and that tends to be more or less the public sector. 50 to 60 are companies which are typically doing what they're supposed to do, nothing more, nothing less, right on the money, right? Good 60 to 70 are companies which are now growing. They have a larger set of investors. They are in a phase where they need to engage more and more with not just domestic established investors, but also global investors. And leadership category, and you'll see that's a really narrow sort of bunch of companies. Leadership category is companies which are actually have positioned themselves as far as governance practices at the global best. And you'll find that the curve from going from 50 to 60 all the way to crossing the threshold of 70, it's a very, very steep slope. So it's not about checking the box that I have 5 policies in place and therefore I'm going to get the score. I think that there is a requirement to have greater change in terms of behavior and building greater trust, better transparency, disclosure before companies can actually reach that particular stage. So 2021 results we haven't put here because that we're going to announce a little later, but I can only tell you that the number of companies in the leadership category has increased once again. It's not, it has increased once again, and by and large, we're seeing that the quality of governance practices has been inching up over the years as far as capital markets in India are concerned. Do we have a long way to go? I think it's a moving benchmark, right? It's always going to be a journey, and we can always argue that there is more to be done. But should we be disheartened by the progress? Certainly not. I think companies have done pretty well on some of the aspects. These are the companies which were in the leadership category in 2020. As you can see, a couple of things. One is that it is size agnostic. You don't have to be a Sensex or a Nifty stock to have good governance practices. I think the second thing is it is also industry agnostic. So just to say that because you're a startup and you just entered the space, you can't have good governance practices is also not true. So some of these things are important to keep in mind when you're looking at when companies, specifically startups, are looking at their own governance journey. That a lot of this is possible independent of size, independent of profitability, independent of industry. It's basically ensuring that you have intent to get this to be able to be focused on some of these things. And when we look at again correlation of scores vis-a-vis the category of scoring, the responsibilities of the board as a category is really the largest correlation we have with the overall score. So basically all of this gets driven by the board. The role of the board in setting strong governance practices cannot be underestimated. And therefore for startups, having a good quality, strong board which is diverse, not just in gender, but also in skill sets, will make a significant difference to how you will approach your governance journey. We're going to cover certain aspects of the scoring, and this we think are the critical ones. If we start sort of talking about the entire scorecard, will take a very, very long time. So we've narrowed it down to 3 or 4 aspects. One is board diversity. I think in the Indian regulatory context, we're only looking at gender diversity, but diversity is beyond gender, right? It's like having the right set of skills, having the right set of mix, having the right set of experiences, and therefore ensuring that the diversity works towards the company's future. So if you look at India, right, from having a non-executive director with with knowledge of the company's domain, I think we do pretty well. Some of this you could argue is because also have a lot of independent directors who understand the domain of the business. So India does pretty well on this particular aspect. What India needs to do better, and this is interesting from a startup space as well, is that the focus on technology at the board level, making it a board skill. I think that needs to improve significantly. Given where and given that everybody, the whole world has gone through the entire COVID crisis, work from home, all of that. That's just one element of technology, right? The other piece is e-commerce. The other piece is cybersecurity. So do you really look at this in a much more holistic sense? And quota committees now said that cybersecurity comes as part of risk management committees charter. Sort of SEBI's also looked at this fairly seriously. But I think corporate India needs a little bit of focus on this particular issue. Having one woman independent director on the board, I think are pretty good, 90 to 96%. But the whole debate now needs to shift from saying having one independent woman director on the board to saying percentage of board composition, right, for diversity perspective. So by and large, checking the regulatory box companies do. I think now we need to look at it in a little bit more meaningful context of saying percentage of women on the board, right? This is how board composition is for the top 500 companies, Nifty 500. Roughly half the directors are independent directors, right? Now 10% is essentially tenured independent directors, and these will all fall off in 2014 as the whole grandfathering of the tenure 2024 as the whole grandfathering of the tenure goes away. So slow and steady, we are seeing actually both sort of refresh over a period of time, move from having long tenure directors to getting a fresher set of boards. And the entire transition has allowed boards to do this with a little bit more stability than simply waking up one day and refreshing the board completely. So institutional memory has been contained and maintained, and while the transition is actually happening. Most of the board members don't belong to the promoters. When you see the diagram on the right, promoter reps are essentially representations of institutions. So HDFC's representation on HDFC Life or HDFC Bank, S&P's representation on the board of CRISIL, those would be promoter representation. Promoters are, of course, family. Interestingly, what's going to happen is what we need to watch out for is whether this construct stays once the regulation kicks in to separate the role of the chairperson and the CEO, and to ensure that the two of them are not related. Does that therefore mean that the board structure will change and you have less number of independent directors is open to debate. Today, 15 control of the board as well. They are chairpersons, right? And most of them are executive chairpersons. So therefore, that's the structure. And will this actually eventually change over a period of time is something which we need to sort of see. Global best practices, of course, suggest that at least 50% of the board must be comprised independent directors, but whether this is actually something corporate India follows or not, we'll have to sort of wait and watch. There's been this debate around tenure for independent directors, right? I mean, if you argue, it doesn't really matter, which is a legitimate argument, but it's not something which is measurable to that extent. And therefore, to make it a much more measurable argument, globally, you've seen regulators bring in some kind of a tenure cap. Now, some of it is comply or explain approach. Some of it is, simply a very mandatory rotation approach. But therefore, by and large, you're seeing 9 to 12 years or 8 to 12 years is where the median is. And India's picked 10 years as a number. So that's pretty much where we're going to sort of end up being, right? When you look at diversity, and again, this is more in the context of gender diversity, right? I think the argument of saying that when the whole regulation came in to say that women need to be on the board, and the fact that you have 2/3 of corporate India being promoter run, the entire myth was that promoters will check the box. They get the family members to be on the board to fill the women director seat. And that's not really true, right? So if you look at the entire split, promoter reps who are non-executive, it's just about, promoters who are non-executive is just about 8%, even for women, even for men. So corporate India has been fairly careful about how it's got people on its board. And I think that's the one heartening piece around this entire debate around comply versus explain vis-a-vis actually pushing through regulation. But have we done enough as far as having gender diversity on the board? This is really how the impact of regulation. So you had, prior to actually just saying you need to have one woman on the board, like women comprise 6% of board positions, right? And slowly and steadfastly, once the regulations come in, that's inched up all the way to 17%. Every year it's grown by about 1%. I think the last few years remain stagnant. I suspect a little bit also because of the COVID crisis, where boards were busy with we're dealing with some of the more pressing sort of issues. Gender diversity in other markets. So this is an approach that the gender diversity in other markets. This is an approach you see in other markets as well, where you're trying to enforce either as a comply explain approach or it's mandatory. And in a lot of the markets, you're actually looking at a threshold which is based on percentage of board size, right? So that 30 to 40% is really what you're actually looking at. These are some of the examples around best practices on skill diversity, and this is like Marico, for example, actually talks about, more importantly, the fact that the promoter doesn't have all skills. And this is a more real and true sort of assessment around skill diversity. This is Infosys, and I'm going to be a little bit more quick on this. Again, CG scores in terms of, board effectiveness. One of the things that we Indian companies sort of still don't articulate very well is really what is the board assessment and what is the assessment plan. And what is the board going to achieve over a period of time, and how do they do an objective assessment. I think while they disclose process, the clarity around what will it mean for investors isn't really there. We find some of the companies setting examples in India very good. Marico is one of them. HSBC is another, which talks about, and this is globally, which talks about, really evaluate several things, including corporate culture in terms of what that really means. This is a contentious issue, right? Executive remuneration. And actually, the issue become far more salient when we look at the COVID crisis. Have promoters paid themselves more vis-a-vis when you have employees taking pay cuts? We've seen several of these examples. And one of the larger issues that we look at is alignment of interest to investors, as well as area where companies need to do much, much better. We do have companies which talk about some of these aspects in a lot more detail when they're looking at measuring and aligning the interest. Infosys and Neogen Technologies, which talk about how do they target the returns and how do they look at benchmarking the returns of Unilever as an example, which talks about the fact that ESG statistics or ESG targets need to be built into CEO performance. And when we talk about sustainability, and we will be talking about sustainability throughout this entire event, really, where does the responsibility lie, right? If it lies with the leadership, does the leadership have it embedded in targets? And that's really what will make it flow through the entire organization. And the last issue, of course, is clawbacks. This is Goldman Sachs. Clearly, clawed back remuneration of the CEO and several others for failure to provide controls, and for the participation of Goldman Sachs in some of these on the entire, or the role of Goldman Sachs in the one MDB scam in Malaysia. This is something we just don't see in India, and this is something that we think NRCs now need to look at, or nomination committees need to look at more seriously. I'm going to managing stakeholder interest. Again, one of the issues here is, are you looking at, do you have conflict of interest with policies in place? Do you have structured mechanisms in place to address some of these issues? Is the fact that even during the COVID crisis, right, we've seen enough number of companies actually stretch payables, stretch suppliers, trying to maintain their working capital. And this is behavior that we find needs to be as far as the stakeholders are concerned. This is the assessment that we do, right, for companies, where we will give them we will benchmark the companies to the BSE 100. We will tell them what the path is to the next stage and what they can actually do better. The sample report is downloadable from the resource center on the event link, and we encourage you to actually do that. Let me answer the final question as we turn into the last 3 or 4 minutes. Do markets really reward governance? And the idea of also going through a lot of this assessment is, if you measure governance, what does it really mean, right? So if you look at companies with score 60 and above, which is the good and the leadership category, and you look at companies with score 60 and below, which is the fair and basic sort of check the box kind of an approach, kind of companies, we find that in our study over a period of time, right, companies which had better governance practices tended to outperform the index, and those which are not so well governed, right? So markets actually reward governance. From a price performance perspective, also they tend to be better, even when markets are doing not doing well, or markets are doing better. The price performance tend to be better than portfolio level to reward companies which are better governed. And these companies tend to have lower stock volatility, right? Stock beta. Again, this is back tested in the sense that we looked at last year, we looked at the company that we had evaluated in 2018 and saw how they fared going forward. One is to say that is there a value that governance provides, and the other, of course, is to say that are we testing the model properly, and enough. So very clearly, markets are rewarding better governed companies in terms of price performance, in terms of stock beta, and therefore having strong period of time. I'm going to stop here. We're fresh out of time. I understand there are a few questions which have actually come in. I'll be happy to sort of send out the responses separately, but thank you very much for your time.